I had my first real boyfriend when I was in high school, and we stayed together all the way till uni, when we both started working. A few months into both of our first jobs, though, we started drifting apart and getting into plenty of arguments. We didn't call it quits quite yet, probably because neither of us really had the heart to. As I started getting to know my colleagues, I found myself spending more and more time with them and less with my boyfriend. Part of my group of colleagues was an older guy. I was 20 and he was 37. He was pretty good looking, serious, and quiet, probably because he'd also just joined the company. One day, he started messaging me for work-related stuff. Then we started talking about other stuff. Pretty soon, we chatted quite frequently. I would say there was mild flirting, but really was just getting to know each other. My relationship with my boyfriend never improved, and one morning before work, we decided to break it off. I was super distraught at work, panicking and realizing I wasn't quite ready for things to end yet. My colleagues decided to take me out after work for drinks to calm me down, and I did drink quite a lot. I'm not really a drinker usually either, so getting drunk is pretty rare for me. Obviously, I couldn't drive in this sort of condition, so the older guy volunteered to drive me home. Everyone else started to leave, and soon it was just the two of us in the bar. I told him that I wanted to leave as well because it was getting pretty late. Actually, I wanted to go home and talk to my boyfriend about getting back together. He convinced me to stay and drink a bit more though, which I stupidly did. The rest of the night remains a haze, as I don't really remember what happened after. All I know is the next morning, I woke up in an unknown motel, naked and next to the older guy. He woke up with a smile and began to tell me dreamily about how passionately we'd made love last night, and so on. I was filled with horror. I couldn't remember anything from the night before. All I could remember was crying the whole night. I recall repeatedly telling him I wanted to go home all night too. It's all just a frustrating blur though. I started crying and he panicked and drove me back to my parents' house. Before I climbed out of his car, he leaned over to kiss me on the lips, but I avoided him and rushed out. A few minutes later, I received a text from him telling me how much fun he'd had and how in love with me he was. I was super creeped out. I told him I wasn't ready for another relationship, but we could stay friends if he liked. I was really young and naive at that time. After that, he would text me multiple times a day, even during work hours, telling me how much he loved me. I tried my best to avoid him, but I hadn't told anyone about what happened, so I couldn't stop him from coming along to our colleague outings. I began to dread those as well, because he would always try to sit next to me during meals or meetings and quietly slip his hand under the table and stroke my thighs or crotch. Once, when it was just the two of us in the office elevator after work, he suddenly pushed me against the back wall and started kissing me and squeezing me, stopping only when I pushed him away. Looking back now, I don't know why I didn't just leave or tell somebody. I was really young and it was my first job. I didn't want people to know that I'd slept with this stranger at work. I was stupidly conscious of being labeled something. This goes on for a few months, and I never did anything while he continued. I reconciled with my boyfriend, and we moved back in together. I never told him about the stuff with the older guy. When the older guy found out I was back with my boyfriend though, that's when shit started to get real crazy. He found out where we lived, and I would catch his car across the street most nights. He would just stay in his car outside all the way till morning. On weekends, when we went out for meals, I would see his car parked outside where we were eating, or suddenly notice him seated behind us in the same cinema. He even followed us to church once. That one still gives me chills, because I had not expected that at all. He seemed to appear in the most random places, so to me it felt as if I could not escape him, either at work or outside of it. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, but I never confronted him because I didn't want my boyfriend to find out. The older guy kept telling me about how passionate I was during our night together. I became scared that maybe I really had acted that way. I didn't want my boyfriend to find out and leave me, although I was pretty sure I was too drunk to be anywhere near as enthusiastic as he described. His messages and phone calls became more frequent. I was so scared of the whole thing coming out in the open, I would reply to his texts and calls, which mainly consisted of him breaking down on the phone, demanding I leave my boyfriend. I found out a few weeks later I was pregnant with my boyfriend's child. Of course, we were happy and decided to have a small wedding. When the older guy found out, he became convinced the child was his, and he started cornering me at work. He told me he would marry me, and he was already planning to get a new home for us. He had the perfect name for our child, etc. The final straw was when he showed up suddenly at my front door with a ring, hysterical about marrying me. I was really scared, but I managed to put him off by telling him I really would think about it. The incident really freaked me out, so I decided to tell another male colleague about all of this. He went to talk with the older guy and threatened him to stop that bullshit. I couldn't take the pressure of dealing with it though, so I decided to quit my job. That didn't stop him from still messaging me and showing up everywhere, including my home. Thankfully, we moved to a new place after our wedding. I took the opportunity to change my phone number as well. He resorted to emailing me poetry and long emails about wanting to get together, but I was so far removed from him now I could just ignore him. After a while, he seemed to finally give up. My male colleague later informed me the guy had decided to migrate to another country because he was so heartbroken, not like I cared much. Life went on after that. I had my child, who I loved to death, and a fulfilling marriage with my boyfriend, now made husband. That was until I attended my former colleague's wedding, and there he was. I felt my heart drop to the floor, but tried not to show it because I had my husband and child with me. We were seated at the same table the whole night, and I caught him staring at me the entire time. The worst, though, was when I left to go to the bathroom and returned to see him cradling my baby in his arms. He had asked my husband if he could hold him and kept snuggling against my child. I quickly snatched him back away and told my husband I wanted to leave early. My husband did ask who the guy was, but I brushed him off by telling him it was some colleague I never really spoke to at work. Nothing happened after that until I suddenly received a text message a few days later from a random number asking how I was doing. I asked who it was, and I got a reply telling me it was him. I ignored the message, and the next day changed my number again. I still received random emails and texts from him though for years. I've changed my number extremely frequently, but besides those messages, thankfully nothing else has happened. It's been a few years now since the very last one. I do get nightmares every once in a while of him suddenly appearing again. I get so paranoid about him showing up, I check random cars while I'm out and about sometimes. The most recent thing I heard about him was when my male colleague messaged me a few months ago to let me know that the guy had been scrounging around trying to ask if there was still a chance of us getting back together again. I wish I could somehow erase that nightmarish year out of my life, but what's done is done, so I hope he just stays away forever. For context, I'm a tiny 24-year-old woman, and I live with my boyfriend in a very small apartment complex, maybe about 30 units. It's a pretty safe town, too. We've been there for almost 2 years now. This story takes place late October 2017. Also important, my designated parking space is the farthest from the entrance of our complex, and it borders the back gravel lot, which is for visitors or residents who don't have a designated space. And that's the area where my boyfriend parks because we only got one to share between each of us. The back lot is to the left of my space, and the space to the right of me is a vacant/unassigned one, and has been for over a year. A few months before this story takes place, a white van had periodically been parking in that vacant space to the right of me. It was never consistent though. They would usually park in the back lot or in one of the 4 marked visitor spaces instead. It had become increasingly frequent though that they would park right next to me, even when there were closer spots that were also vacant. It was a Sunday, I believe, and I'd just gotten home from getting my hair cut. I pulled into the parking lot and noticed a charcoal gray sedan with heavily tinted windows in a vacant spot next to mine. The car was running as well. I found this quite odd. There were several designated and visitor spots open, and I'd never seen this car before. As I was pulling into my space, the car shut off. I'm naturally cautious, so this seemed very odd to me as well. I was listening to Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, so I decided to wait and finish the song I was on to see what would happen. Especially since I couldn't leave such a good song unfinished. Mostly though because I felt really anxious and I had the feeling I was being watched. I tried to reason to myself that perhaps they were waiting for someone else. I know I have a tendency to be paranoid. I needed to collect myself before leaving and figure out what was going on. After the song, I turned off my car and hurried inside, where my boyfriend was waiting for us to get ready to go meet his family for his brother's birthday outing. We were in our apartment for about 20 minutes while I changed clothes. We walked out to the gravel lot where his car was parked, when I noticed that the charcoal gray car was no longer next to mine. Instead, it was now next to my boyfriend's car, and it was once again running. At this point, I mentioned to him how odd it was they were still here and had moved to that different part of the lot. We went out for a few hours, and the car was no longer there when we got back. The next day, I had off from work. I got in my car to go pick up groceries, only to notice there was a note on my windshield. I immediately began to shake. Somehow, as I grabbed it, I just knew it was from those people in that gray car. I was so panicked I almost couldn't fully read what they wrote to me. I just started to tear up as a fear response. I won't quote the entire thing because much of it was very graphic, but here's the part I will share. Hi, you must not remember us. At approximately 5:32 p.m. on the 29th of October, you pulled up next to us. Although you appeared pensive or preoccupied, we just couldn't help but stare. We're very serious about pleasing others, and we would be honored to be the ones to train you. They shared some incredibly detailed plans, which I didn't ask for. You can guess what they probably were. I was able to compose myself and went to pick up groceries, then called my boyfriend. He came home for his lunch break and we emailed our landlord. He went back to work and I spent the rest of the day in shock. I felt so violated. This is my home. This is supposed to be a safe place, and those strangers violated that. I don't shame them for their kinks, but this was not the way to go about them. They came to my home. They painted a picture of me and them I didn't want. They gave me a reason to be paranoid and afraid they would make that disgusting picture a reality. It took a few days, but I did call the police. They came up to our apartment and I told them my story. They collected the note that was left. They ended up calling the creeps, but I never heard back. Interestingly enough, I never saw that white van that used to occasionally park next to me after that either. I was so surprised. I didn't expect the police to take this seriously at all, because some of the other things I'd heard out there. I didn't expect the fully caring response they gave. My boss changed my schedule up so I'd get home when it was still light out. And I called my friends or boyfriend every time I walked to or from my car for weeks. It was difficult to write this post, and I'm holding back on sharing the full extent of how I felt. What I do know is, it's strange they were parked next to me with all those open spaces. It's strange they turned their car off whenever I parked. It's strange how they always move spaces to follow us. They left enough info that I was able to look them up on Facebook. I had one mutual friend with this guy, surprisingly, who was an old heroin junkie coworker. I immediately blocked and unfriended him, and blocked the other guy as well. It's been quite a while since that incident, but I'm still vigilant when walking to our apartment. The most unnerving part, aside from the graphic plan, is the fact that while I was still composing myself in the car, they must have seen that. They made it very known they were approaching me, and that they knew it made me scared. I'm glad I sought help, though. This happened around 10 years ago in 2008 or 2009. I was visiting my grandmother in a rural section of the Ozarks, near a small town with a hilarious name where I went to high school. I was very familiar with the area, and when visiting my grandmother, I would often walk into town, taking backwood trails until I reached the main road into town. Very rarely, someone would stop and offer a ride, and normally I would accept. It's a small town in a rural area where everyone mostly knows everyone else, so I wouldn't even look up until I was getting into the vehicle. I stopped accepting rides after this incident, though. I had just come out of the woods as I was walking along the side of the road. I was maybe a mile or two out of town, really enjoying my walk, when an older blue Ford Taurus pulled up next to me. The driver rolled down the passenger window. "Need a ride?" I heard. I started to walk over. I got in and got a good look at my driver. The man almost looked like a greasier version of Charles Manson or something. Flat, stringy brown hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in over a week that came down to his jawline. He had a salt and pepper 5 o'clock shadow and piercing blue eyes. Something about this guy was ringing every alarm bell in my body. I went to get back out of the car, but we were already in motion. Instead, I began to look around the vehicle. The front was relatively normal, even clean. The back seat was covered up with a blanket, though. On top of the blanket was something that took up nearly the entire back seat, wrapped up in a tarp. Whatever it was stood about 1.5 feet off the back seat. On top of it all was a big black shaggy dog that was staring right through me. "What are you doing here?" The question snapped me back to the front seat. "I'm sorry, what?" I asked. He was staring at me instead of the road. "What are you doing here?" "Oh, I'm visiting my grandmother. I live in College Town, about 90 miles from here, and I'm on my way to see some old friends." A big frown came over his face. "No. Why are you here?" I frowned a little. Everything in me was flashing to get out now. I just told you." My tension was rising visibly. The dog began to growl at me from the back seat. Now we were passing the sign for the county line. There was a gas station coming up that marked the beginning of the town. He was still staring at me, though. "Why are you here? Why the fuck are you here?" He began to scream over and over at me out of nowhere, slamming his hands against the steering wheel. I huddled against the door, shaking. He pulled into the gas station. "Give me your glasses." It was a statement, not a question. No emotion either. I just handed them over as he told me to wait there and went into the store. I was frozen in place, shaking and trying to will my arms or legs to work, trying to start my breathing again too. I knew whatever the hell was going on here, I needed to get out right now. The dog growled at me again, and that snapped me back into action. I got up, almost rolling out of the car. I walked into the store shaking, and in an equally shaking voice, I said to the man, "This is close enough to where I'm going. I'd like my glasses back now, please." My eyesight is very poor, but I could feel the intensity of the glare he was giving me. I think the cashier could too, because she took a couple steps back and grabbed the store phone. He silently handed my glasses to me and continued to stare daggers at me as I put them on. Then he walked out the store without saying a single word to either of us. The cashier looked at me, clearly freaked out. "What the fuck was that?" she asked me. The adrenaline of the situation started to wear off, and the real gravity started to sink in on me. Tears began to silently fall down my face. I asked her to use the phone. She nodded and handed it to me with a box of tissues. She told me I could go to the manager's office to make my phone call and take as much time as I needed. I thanked her, went back, and let my friends know what just happened. I also told them I'd be cutting through the woods to get to them because I didn't want to see that guy ever again. I would be coming out from behind their house. I took a few minutes to breathe and relax after I hung up. When I went back out, the cashier asked if I was okay and if there was anything she could do for me. I thanked her again and told her no. I asked if she knew the guy. Apparently, she had never seen him before and didn't think he was from the area. That shook me even more. I gave her my friend's phone number and asked her to call them if he came back. I left and cut through the woods to my friend's house. We had a great afternoon actually, and when I was ready to leave, they gave me a ride home. At the time, I tried not to let it bother me as much, but the longer I've had to think about it, the more curious I am about what was in the back seat. The dog wasn't moving from on top of it unless the guy told him to. I try not to think about what was underneath that tarp too much. It looked just like how someone lying in the fetal position would look like from behind.